My name is Grace Monroe, and for 2 years I had known that loving Nathaniel Whitmore meant living under the shadow of his family name. The Whitmores were the kind of family whose wealth seemed almost unreal. The Whitmores were the kind of family whose wealth seemed almost unreal. Their name opened doors before anyone even touched the handle. At the center of that world stood Franklin Whitmore. Nathaniel's father was a legendary billionaire who had disappeared from public life nearly 10 years earlier. Franklin had disowned his eldest son after that son married a woman he considered unsuitable for the family. Nathaniel had always feared his father's judgment. Now I was engaged to him, and I had become part of that judgment too. The most important dinner of my life was approaching. Nathaniel spent the entire week preparing me for it. He gave me rules. Do not talk about your work at the nonprofit. Do not mention that your parents lived in a small house and never had much money. Wear the navy dress, wear the cashmere scarf I bought for you. And above everything else, do not be late. Nathaniel told me his father believed lateness revealed something dangerous about a person. I tried to laugh about it, but Nathaniel did not smile. On the afternoon of the dinner, I left early and took the train toward the Whitmore estate. When I reached the final station, I decided to walk the remaining distance. The road seemed to belong to another world. Huge homes stood behind tall gates. Luxury cars moved quietly along the streets. Every building reminded me that I was an outsider. I checked my watch and realized I still had enough time. Then I saw the old man sitting alone on a bench. He looked exhausted. His coat was thin and his hands trembled from the cold. His face carried deep lines that seemed to come from years of hardship rather than age. I almost kept walking. I was already thinking about Nathaniel rules and the dinner waiting for me. Then I remembered something my grandmother had always said. The true measure of a person is how they treat someone who can do nothing for them. So I stopped. I sat beside the stranger and asked if he was all right. He looked at me with clear blue eyes and quietly said he had missed the shelter meal that afternoon. Without thinking, I opened my bag and handed him my lunch. He stared at the sandwich as though I had given him something priceless. Then I noticed how badly he was shivering. I removed my cashmere scarf and wrapped it around his shoulders. He touched the fabric and looked directly into my eyes. "You are a very kind woman." I smiled and told him everyone deserved warmth. Then I checked my watch. I was late, not a little late. 17 minutes late. The wind cut through my dress as I hurried along the road. My shoes struck the pavement with every step. I knew I was risking the future I had spent 2 years building. Still, I could not regret the choice I had made on that bench. I stood up and ran toward the estate, knowing Nathaniel would be waiting. The Whitmore estate appeared at the end of the road like something from another century. Tall stone walls surrounded the property. Black iron gates stood open beneath massive stone pillars. Beyond them, I could see perfectly trimmed trees and a long driveway leading toward a mansion with dozens of windows. My heart was pounding as I hurried toward the entrance. Nathaniel was standing at the top of the stone steps. The moment he saw me, his expression changed. First came relief, then anger. He walked down several steps before meeting me. 17 minutes. His voice was low but sharp. "I am sorry," I said while trying to catch my breath. He looked at my empty neck. "Where is the scarf?" I knew immediately that he was not asking because he cared about me. I gave it to someone who needed it. Nathaniel stared at me as though I had confessed to destroying something priceless. "You gave it away. There was an old man on a bench." "Grace, this is not the time." He was freezing. Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment. "Do you understand what tonight means?" "I do." "No, you do not." He pointed toward the mansion. "My father has been watching everything for years. He does not forgive mistakes." I looked back toward the road. "Neither do I." Nathaniel looked confused. I had expected him to understand why I had helped the old man. Instead, I saw only fear. I told him the scarf was replaceable. He answered that it was not about the scarf. It was about what my choice said about me. That sentence stayed between us. Then the front door opened. A tall butler stepped outside. "Mr. Whitmore is waiting." Nathaniel immediately straightened his jacket. I followed him through the doorway. The marble foyer was enormous. A crystal chandelier hung above us. Paintings covered the walls. Everything was beautiful and completely unfamiliar. The butler led us toward the dining room. I could hear the faint sound of silverware being arranged. Nathaniel leaned toward me. Please just follow my lead, I nodded. The dining room doors opened, a table stretched almost the entire length of the room. At the far end sat one person, an elderly man. His shoulders were covered by my cashmere scarf. My breath stopped. I knew those blue eyes. I knew that worn face. It was the stranger from the bench. Nathaniel stopped walking. His face became completely pale. Father. The old man slowly lifted his eyes. For several seconds he looked at his son without speaking. Then his attention moved toward me. The cold expression disappeared. The same warm smile I had seen on the bench returned. Welcome, Grace. His voice was calm. Please come and sit beside me. Nathaniel looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath him. I could barely move. The man I had thought was homeless was Franklin Whitmore, the billionaire, the father. Nathaniel had spent years trying to impress, and the man whose approval had supposedly been impossible to earn. Franklin touched the scarf around his shoulders. Then he smiled at me again. I believe we have already met. No one moved for several seconds. The butler stood completely still while Nathaniel looked from his father to me and then back again. Franklin pointed toward the chair beside him. Grace, sit here. I walked slowly toward the table. My hands were shaking. I had spent the entire week preparing for a formal dinner with a mysterious billionaire. I had never imagined that I would meet him on a park bench. First, Franklin waited until I sat down. Then he looked at Nathaniel. Close the door. Nathaniel obeyed. The door shut quietly. Franklin rested both hands on the table. For 10 years, people have come into this house trying to impress me. He looked directly at me. Executives have arrived with perfect suits and rehearsed speeches. Politicians have brought expensive gifts. Business leaders have memorized every detail of my career. Family members have spent years trying to prove that they deserve my approval. Then he looked at Nathaniel, and tonight my son brought you here. Nathaniel swallowed hard. Father, I can explain. You will have your chance. Franklin turned back toward me. I watched you from that bench for nearly 20 minutes before you spoke. I did not know what to say, he continued. You looked at your watch more than once. You knew you were running late, yet you sat down anyway. I remembered the moment clearly. You could have walked past me. You could have given me directions to a shelter. You could have offered a few dollars and continued toward this house. Instead, you gave me your lunch. Franklin smiled. Then you gave me your scarf. Nathaniel lowered his head. Franklin continued speaking. That scarf cost $700. Nathaniel looked up in surprise. You knew the price. Of course I knew. Franklin looked at me, but you did not. That was the point I suddenly understood. This entire meeting had been planned, not by Nathaniel, by Franklin. Franklin had wanted to know who I was when I believed nobody important was watching. Nathaniel had thought the test was about clothing and punctuality. Franklin knew it was about character. I looked toward Nathaniel. He seemed deeply ashamed. Franklin spoke again. Your son told you to hide your work. He told you not to mention your parents. He told you to wear expensive clothing. He believed I cared about those things. Nathaniel closed his eyes. I made a mistake. You made many mistakes. Franklin's voice remained calm. But this woman did something you never expected. She ignored every rule that mattered to you and followed the one rule that mattered to me. Nathaniel looked confused. Which rule? Franklin answered without hesitation. Treat people well when you have nothing to gain from them. Silence filled the room. Then Franklin reached for the scarf. He slowly removed it from his shoulders. He held it carefully, as though it had become something more valuable than its price. He handed it back to me. Thank you for giving me warmth tonight, Grace. I accepted it with both hands. Then Franklin looked at his son. Now we can finally have dinner. Dinner began quietly. The servants brought several courses, but I barely noticed the food. Franklin asked about my work. For the first time that evening, I did not feel nervous about answering. I told him about the nonprofit where I worked. I explained how we helped families who were struggling with housing and food. Franklin listened without interrupting. Then he asked about my parents. I told him they lived in a modest neighborhood and had spent their entire lives working hard. My father repaired appliances. My mother taught children at a local school. They had never owned expensive cars or lived in a mansion, but they had always taught me that money was useful only when it could make someone's life better. Franklin smiled. That is exactly what I wanted to hear. Nathaniel remained silent. I looked at him. He seemed different from the man who had been waiting for me on the steps. His confidence was gone. He looked like a son who had finally realized how badly he had misunderstood his father. Franklin eventually turned toward him. Nathaniel, why did you think Grace needed to hide those things? Nathaniel looked down. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what? That you would reject her. Franklin gave a small laugh. I rejected your brother because he chose money over loyalty. I never rejected him because of the woman he loved. Nathaniel looked shocked. You never told me that. You never asked. The words hit him hard. Franklin continued. For 10 years, you believed I wanted a perfect family. What I wanted was an honest one. Nathaniel looked at me. I am sorry, Grace. I said nothing. He continued. I was so afraid of losing my father's approval that I started changing you into someone I thought he would accept. Franklin nodded slow. And that is exactly what you should never do to someone you... Slow, Nathaniel wiped his eyes. I know dessert arrived. Franklin asked me to tell him about my grandmother. I smiled. She was the person who taught me the most important lesson of my life, the one about helping people who could do nothing for you. Franklin looked at the scarf resting beside my plate. She taught you well. The evening ended differently from how I had imagined. There had been no interrogation, no humiliating judgment, no demand that I prove my worth. Instead, there had been an unexpected conversation about family and kindness. At the door, Franklin stopped Nathaniel. He spoke quietly but firmly. Do not ever underestimate this woman again. Nathaniel nodded. Franklin continued. Your place in this family is secure because she reminded you what kind of man you should become. Nathaniel looked at me, then he looked at his father. I understand. Franklin placed a hand on his shoulder. Go home. Talk to her. And listen, this time, Nathaniel took my hand. We walked away from the mansion together. Neither of us spoke during the first few minutes. Then Nathaniel stopped beside the driveway. I am ashamed. I looked at him. He continued, I spent 2 years asking you to become smaller so I could feel bigger. I never understood how cruel that was. His eyes filled with tears. I am sorry, Grace. This time his apology sounded different. It sounded honest. We sat together on a bench near the estate entrance, the same road where everything had changed only hours earlier. Nathaniel told me how much pressure he had felt growing up. He had spent years believing his father could disappear again. If he made one wrong decision, he thought perfection was the only way to keep his family together. I listened, then I told him something I had been afraid to say. I did not want to marry a man who was terrified of his own father. I wanted to marry a man who knew what he believed. Nathaniel nodded. I want to become that man. I looked at him carefully. Wanting it is not enough, I know. He took my hand. Then he promised that he would never again ask me to hide my family or my work. He promised he would never measure my worth by clothing or money. Most importantly, he promised that if we built a life together, it would be built on honesty. I believed him, not because Franklin had approved of me, but because Nathaniel had finally understood what mattered. 3 months passed. During that time, Nathaniel changed in ways I could actually see. He stopped correcting the way I spoke about money. He stopped worrying about what wealthy people might think. He began volunteering with me at the nonprofit. He met my parents without trying to impress them, and slowly our relationship became lighter. Franklin also changed. He began visiting us more often. The frightening billionaire I had heard about was not the man I knew. He was funny. He loved old movies. He complained about modern technology. He once spent an entire afternoon trying to repair a broken garden chair while refusing help from 3 employees. One evening, he told me something I would never forget. Grace, I spent years believing people wanted my money. Most of them did. But that night on the bench, you had no idea who I was. That made your kindness more valuable than anything anyone has ever given me. I asked him why he had stayed hidden for so long. He said wealth had made it difficult to know who truly cared about him. So he had stopped giving people the chance to pretend. Then he smiled. But you did not know you were being tested. That was the only way I could finally see the truth. Our wedding was planned for the following spring. Nathaniel wanted a grand ceremony at a country club I refused. My parents' backyard was enough. There were flowers along the fence, simple chairs filled the lawn, neighbors helped prepare the food, friends stood beside us. Franklin arrived wearing a beautifully tailored suit, but around his shoulders was something I recognized immediately: my cashmere scarf. I laughed when I saw it. Franklin smiled. I believe I have earned the right to wear it now. I walked toward the ceremony with my parents beside me. Nathaniel waited at the end of the garden. For the first time, I did not feel like I was entering his world. We were creating our own, and Franklin Whitmore was there, not as a terrifying billionaire, but as the father of the man I loved. When I reached Nathaniel, he took both my hands. His eyes were filled with tears. He whispered that he had never seen me look more beautiful. I smiled because I finally understood what had changed. I no longer needed his father approval. I no longer needed anyone approval. That night on the bench had changed everything. That simple gift became the bridge between two families forever. Franklin stood nearby watching us. The scarf rested proudly around his shoulders. When the ceremony began, he looked toward my parents and smiled. They smiled back. There was no competition between families, no concern about status, no discussion about money. There was only love. After we exchanged our vows, Franklin approached us. He hugged Nathaniel first, then he hugged me. He whispered something that made me laugh. "You still owe me a sandwich." I looked at him in surprise. "You ate the whole thing." He smiled. "Exactly." Everyone laughed. Later that evening, we sat together beneath the backyard lights. Franklin told stories about Nathaniel as a child. Nathaniel protested every embarrassing detail. My father joined the conversation. My mother brought more dessert. For a moment, I looked around and realized how different this family felt from the one I had feared. It was not perfect, but it was honest, and honesty had been the one thing missing for Yehon. Franklin eventually removed the scarf and handed it to me. I thought he was returning it permanently. Instead, he placed it around my shoulders. "You gave this to a stranger when you thought nobody important was watching." He looked at Nathaniel. That moment showed my son who he needed to become. Then he looked at me. "Never forget that kindness is most powerful when there is no reward waiting for you." I nodded. The dinner I had feared became the beginning of a new life. I had walked toward that estate believing I was being judged. I had worried about my dress, my family, my job, my timing, but none of those things mattered. What mattered was what I did when I saw someone in need. I gave away my lunch, I gave away my expensive scarf, and I arrived 17 minutes late. Yet somehow, being late became the reason I was finally seen for who I really was. Franklin had been watching, but I had not known it. And that was exactly why the choice mattered. Kindness is not measured by applause. It is measured by what you do when nobody seems important enough to notice. That evening, I learned that the greatest test in life may be the one you never know you are taking. Sometimes failing the test everyone expects you to pass can lead you directly toward the life you were meant to have. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video. Subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Thank you for watching, and remember that kindness always matters.